Hey, what's up, AP Macro students? This is Mr. White here with some more FRQ practice for you. So go ahead and get out those FRQ practice questions if you've got them printed out or if you've written them down, and follow along as we go over the solutions to these problems. So here's our first question. And just like with the last set of FRQs, remember to include correctly labeled diagrams if useful or required in explaining your answers. And remember that a correctly labeled diagram must have all axes and curves clearly labeled and must show directional changes. If the question prompts you to calculate, then you must also show how you arrived at your final answer, aka show your work. Okay, so this first question here comes to us from Unit 2. This is another one of those questions about measuring the economy, and this particular one is about unemployment. So the very first thing it would like us to do is it would like us to go ahead and calculate the size of the labor force. We have to show our work. Then we have to calculate the labor force participation rate. Once again, show the work. Then it wants to know, given the state of the economy described in this table, is the actual real output less than, greater than, or equal to the potential real output? And we need to explain. Remember, it's very important if it says explain. Calculate what the cyclical unemployment rate would be if the actual rate of unemployment increased to 5%. Once again, we need to show our work. And last of all, suppose discouraged workers re-enter the labor force and find employment. Will the actual rate of unemployment increase, decrease, or stay the same? Whew, wow, I know this seems like a really hefty question. It might be a little bit tricky, but honestly, it's pretty straightforward, pretty simple. It's easy with a calculator, and if you don't have a calculator, it might take a little bit more time to crunch these numbers, but basically just some simple arithmetic here, and we can arrive at all of our answers to all these problems. Okay, so the very first thing that this question is asking us for is the size of the labor force, which is actually really, really easy. The labor force, hopefully you remember, is equal to employed plus unemployed workers. Okay. In this particular one, we can see that the number of people who are employed is 97 million and the people who are unemployed is 3 million. So very simply, we're just going to say 97 plus 3 equals 100. I'll put M for million. Okay, so in other words, the size of our labor force is 100 million people. That would give you the solution to question A. Okay, once we know that the labor force is 100 million people, then it's pretty easy to figure out the labor force participation rate. The labor force participation rate is equal to the size of the labor force, which in this case is equal to 100 million, divided by the size of the adult population. Let me erase this. Okay, so we've got 125 million people in the population, and we've got, we said 100 million total in the labor force because it's those two put together. Okay, so we're going to do 100 divided by 125. Okay, because as I said, this is just the number of people in the labor force divided by the country's population. And in this case, that would give us 80%. Okay, or in this case, if you do this on your calculator, you're going to come up with 0.8. Just remember that 0.8 is the same thing as 80%. Okay, so if you're like, well, what does that mean? It just means that 80% of the people in the country are actually participating in the labor force. That's really all that number signifies to us. Okay, so now that we've got the labor force participation rate and we've got the size of the labor force nailed down, that's A and B, we can move on to C. Given the state of the economy described in the table, is actual real output less than, greater than, or equal to potential real output? And we need to explain. Okay, so if we just take a little look-see here, it tells us the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, the natural rate of unemployment is when the economy is totally normal, everything's right. That would equal potential real output. Okay, so I'm going to put remember that Y means output. Now, it tells us the actual rate of unemployment. So keep in mind, the natural rate of unemployment is like a hypothetical, theoretical kind of thing, saying like, oh yeah, if we're at this level, then everything's normal. It does not mean that we're actually at that level, okay? That's just like our yardstick. In real life, we are currently sitting at 3% unemployment, okay? So this is actual unemployment. Okay. And this actual unemployment signifies to us our actual Y, right? Our actual level of output. Remember that if unemployment is really low, output should be really high. In other words, if there are a lot of people who have jobs and the unemployment rate is really low, we're probably producing a lot. That makes sense, right? Like, why else would we have so many people working unless we were producing a lot of stuff? Okay, so on part C, given the state of the economy, it looks like output is greater in actual factual than in potential. So in other words, actual output is going to be greater than, okay, I'm going to say, is greater than potential. Okay, and the reason why is because unemployment is less than hopefully you can tell that says potential. Okay, so actual unemployment is less than potential unemployment, and so that tells me that like our actual output is going to be greater than our potential output, just because we have more people working than what we would normally expect to see, and so that means we're producing more stuff than what we would normally expect to be producing. Okay, let me just clean things up here for a second. All right, let's get that last question. It says, actually, no, there's two more questions, my bad. Calculate what the cyclical unemployment rate would be if the actual rate of unemployment increased to 5%. Okay, so if this actual rate was 5%, let's just scratch it out and put 5. Okay, 5%. What that tells us is that actual unemployment is now going to be greater. Is going to be greater than natural. And this is in UE%. Okay. Now, that's a bad thing, right? If more people are unemployed than what we expect, then that tells us something is wrong with the economy. And remember that cyclical unemployment is caused by a downturn in the business cycle. And so generally, anything above our natural rate of unemployment is what we can attribute to cyclical unemployment. So we'll say cyclical is equal to anything above, in this case, we're going to say 4%, right? Because remember that 4% is our natural rate. So anything above 4%, we're just going to say, okay, that's our cyclical unemployment. And with that being the case, this is going to be pretty easy. We said that now actual unemployment is 5%. Well, 5 minus 4 is 1. So that would tell us that 1% of that 5% unemployment should be considered cyclical unemployment. Okay, so that would answer part D from that question. 1% of that 5% would be cyclical. The rest we could say is structural unemployment, or maybe some, well, it wouldn't be seasonal because we take that out of our calculation. Structural, maybe frictional unemployment, but we would not expect anything within our natural rate of unemployment to represent any cyclical unemployment. So anything above the natural rate must be cyclical. All right, last, suppose discouraged workers re-enter the labor force and find employment. Will the actual rate of unemployment increase, decrease, or stay the same? Okay, here's the thing, guys. If the unemployment rate goes down, because, the unemployment rate will go down in this case because the unemployment number isn't going to change, right? It says that these discouraged workers here, and let me go ahead and I'll circle these guys in green, why not? Okay, in case you guys forgot what that means, okay, a discouraged worker is someone who stopped looking for work. Okay, if you can read my bad handwriting. Okay, someone who stopped looking for work. Remember that if you are not looking for work, you're not unemployed. So right now, those 2 million people are able to work and they want to work, but they're just not looking for a job, because they've had a hard time finding a job, so they stopped looking. Well, it's saying, imagine that all of a sudden, magically, those 2 million people re-enter the labor force and right away they get employed. Well, what that means is that this 2 million is going to jump right into this 97 million. So now that would become 99 million. And we're still going to calculate the size of the labor force the same way, right? It's employed plus unemployed. So 99 plus 3, pretty simple math, 102 million, okay? But you'll notice that the number of unemployed people hasn't changed at all, right? The number of employed people changed, but not the number of unemployed people. And so, if we're just looking at this from a math standpoint, what we've had here is a situation where the numerator, 3, hasn't changed, but the denominator went from being 100, okay, to now it's going to be 102, okay? You should know that anytime the denominator gets bigger and the numerator either gets smaller or stays the same, we're always going to have a smaller product. In other words, when this number down here gets bigger, this number over here is going to get smaller. And so this number over here represents our unemployment rate. And so since this number is going to be smaller, it's only going to be fractionally smaller. I think it would be something, it would go from like 3% to like 2.9% unemployment or something like that, which is really not a huge difference, but it is a smaller unemployment rate. So what we would say on E is that if those discouraged workers re-entered the labor force and instantly found employment, the actual rate of unemployment would actually decrease slightly. It would go from 3% down to 2.9%. Now, they don't need that actual calculation to get the right answer, but just make sure that you get the right answer. In essence, the idea is that the unemployment rate would go down, and that's just because, the size of the labor force got bigger, but the unemployment rate didn't get any bigger. Okay, next question. Our good friend, the aggregate supply and demand model. This one's actually pretty easy. This is more or less a short question. Some of the ones we've seen are kind of long, like the last one was considered a long question. This one's a pretty short question. So the country of X is at full employment. We're going to draw a correctly labeled graph of LRAS, SRAS, and aggregate demand, and we'll show current price level and current real output. We're going to label the price level PL and current output as Y1. Then we're going to assume household income increases as a result of recent economic prosperity in country X. On your graph in part A, show the effect of the increase in household income on real output and price level. So what you're going to do is go back to that graph you drew at the beginning, and you're going to show what happens if household income rises. Then for C, what would be the effect of the change identified in part B on unemployment in country X? So if that thing that you just did in part B happened, what would happen to the unemployment rate? And then D, will the change in real output shown in part B be smaller or larger in the presence of automatic stabilizers, meaning things like a progressive tax code or things like unemployment insurance compensation? Okay, so make sure you explain that last one. You can see here it says explain. All right, so let's jump right into this thing. Oh, yeah, just in case you forgot, the notes for this are on Google Classroom Unit 3. I probably should have said that at the beginning of this. Okay, let's rock and roll. Okay, so the very first thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and draw our ASAD model. Hopefully you guys still remember that. If not, take a little look at that big chart of graphs. Remember that down here we've got the level of real GDP. Okay, up here we've got our price level. Okay, and we're going to have our LRAS curve, perfectly inelastic. All right. Now, one thing you want to pay special attention to back in the question, it says the country of X is at full employment. Now, this is important because it tells you where to set up your graph in the beginning. If we're not at full employment, we're not going to start off with our AS and AD curves crossing on the LRAS. Like for example, if we were in a recession, we would start off maybe something like this. Okay, this would be a recession because you can see that this short run equilibrium is to the left of LRAS. Okay, now let me just get rid of those. Okay, if we were having an expansion, like if the economy was like red hot, like lower than normal unemployment rate, we would have something like this, where you can see that our short run equilibrium is to the right of the LRAS. Okay, but once again, it's not telling us that. It's telling us that we are at long run equilibrium, or we're at full employment, which is same thing. Okay, full employment is when they both cross on the LRAS. So make sure that in your response you draw your initial equilibrium of AS and AD. Okay, remember it's okay to put SRAS like this. If it makes you feel better, I'll put SR. Remember, SR, short run aggregate supply. You can also just put aggregate supply. Now, one big thing it asked us to do is we have to label this part as Y1. Remember that Y is shorthand for output. And then over here we had to label this as PL1. Okay, so if you did that part, then you're through about half of this question already. Because like I said, this is not a very hard question. All right, so assume that household income increases as a result of recent economic prosperity in country X. On your graph in part A, show the effect on the increase in household income on real output and price level. Okay, so just remember that this is real output down here. Okay. Just put that in quotation marks, just in case you forgot. Real GDP, real price level, same thing. Okay, if we had an increase of household income, that's going to make consumers demand more goods and services. Consumer spending rises, and so then all of a sudden that becomes 82, and then over here we can call this one 81. Okay, and you'll notice that whenever we have this rightward shift of aggregate demand, my arrow is pretty ugly, but you get the idea. There's an arrow. Okay, whatever. We have this rightward shift of aggregate demand. We're going to have a new equilibrium. And now this is where we get to the main thing they want to know for this question. What happens to output and the price level? Well, now you can see that our output, Y2, is over here. So we had an increase of real output, and price level, PL2, is up there. We had an increase in the price level. So in real life, what that would look like is our country is going to produce more stuff, right? We're going to have a lower unemployment rate because we need people to produce all that new stuff. And because of the fact that everybody's working and demanding things, we know that businesses will need to raise their prices to increase their output. And so that explains why the price level goes up. Okay, there's a lot of reasons why the price level goes up, but we can just see right here on the graph that the price level goes up. Okay, what will be the effect of the change identified in part B on unemployment? Very simple, guys. Anytime that our real output increases, okay, our unemployment rate is going to decrease. They're just inverse of each other. Once again, like I said, just think that real output means how much stuff we're producing. If we're producing more stuff, we need more people to do it, and so that means that more people will get hired and the unemployment rate should fall. Okay, very simple. Then for the last part of this question, what will the change in real output shown in part B, will the change in real output shown in part B be smaller or larger in the presence of automatic stabilizers? Okay. Automatic stabilizers means things like progressive income tax or things like, the unemployment insurance program. Okay, so let me just kind of erase all this stuff here. It can be a little bit of a pain to get all this stuff out of here. It doesn't always want to go very easily. These little dots, yeah, they're very tough. Okay, whatever. All right, so we can say progressive tax. Or we can say unemployment insurance. Okay, this is government spending. Oh, well, you get the idea. Government, yeah, I can't do this, whatever. All right, government spending, and progressive tax is taxation, obviously. Okay, both of these represent what are called automatic fiscal policies. Remember, fiscal policy is changing taxes or change in government spending to influence the economy. And I think I told you guys before that there are some taxation schemes like a progressive tax that automatically change based on income. And there are some kinds of government spending programs that automatically change based on economic conditions. So with the progressive income tax, the easy way to remember this is the more you make, the more they take. That's what I always say, okay? The more you make, the more they take. So basically, if the economy starts doing really well, right? We had that decrease of unemployment, increase of real output, the economy's doing great, everybody's going to be making higher paychecks. And when everybody makes higher paychecks, their taxes go up. And so what that means is that some of that money that we would maybe be estimating that would flow back into the economy through greater consumer spending due to greater paychecks, well, that's not really going to make its way into the economy. That money's going to get siphoned away by the government through the form of higher income taxes, okay? So that would be one type of automatic stabilizer that could dampen some of our economic growth. Now, the other thing is unemployment insurance, right? That's a government spending program. Well, guys, if the unemployment goes down, then this government spending program causes government spending to go down. In other words, if everybody's getting jobs because unemployment is getting lower, right? The unemployment rate's lower, we're producing more stuff, the country's doing great, well, then the government doesn't need to spend as much money on helping people who are unemployed. And so therefore, less government spending also has sort of a dampening effect on what we might expect to see in terms of GDP growth. So in both cases, we would see that the growth in our economic output or the growth in our GDP may not be as high as we anticipate due to the fact that these automatic stabilizers are going to try to slow down the growth of the economy just to sort of prevent any like runaway inflation or anything like that. All right, last question, question 3, and this is kind of a doozy. This is a tricky one. This one's going to involve a little bit more math, so get out your calculators. The economy of new land is in short-run equilibrium. Okay, short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. That's important. The current real output is 400 billion, and the full employment output is 500 billion. Okay, that's also going to be a pretty important thing that we're going to want to pay attention to. Okay, 400 and 500 billion. And the marginal propensity to consume in this case is going to be 0.08. Okay, once again, something we want to pay attention to here. So there's a lot of good information that you really need to very, very carefully examine in the very beginning of this question. Is the economy experiencing a recessionary output gap or an inflationary output gap? And explain. Okay. Now, luckily for this first one, I don't even really need to go to any kind of graphs or anything. We can just totally take a look at the numbers we see right here, 400 billion and 500 billion. Okay. So this is the current real output, meaning like that this is what the economy is actually producing right now. But full employment output is this. Remember that full employment, this is equilibrium. This is when the economy is normal. This is what we expect. Now, since we are lower than what we expect right now, okay, you can see that the real output is only 400 billion. That's less than the full employment output of 500 billion. And so since we're making less stuff than what we expect, we're going to go ahead and say that this represents a recessionary output gap. And the reason why, and this is the explain that you have to do right here, is because 400 billion is less than 500 billion. In other words, the amount our economy is currently producing is less than the amount we should be producing. We're underproducing, we're inefficient. That's a recession. Okay, the next thing we got to talk about here, we're going to just keep this ball rolling. Assume new land's government is considering taking action to close the output gap identified in Part A. First thing you want to do is calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of change in government spending required to shift the aggregate demand curve to close the output gap. Then, if new land's government changes taxes without changing government spending, calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of change in taxes required to shift the aggregate demand curve to close the output gap. And for both of these, we really need to show our work, so keep that in mind. Then which fiscal policy action, changing government spending or taxes, is more effective in closing the output gap? Maybe some of you remember me talking about this in class, so you already kind of know. And then D, assume Newland's government decides not to take any policy action. Will short-run aggregate supply increase, decrease, or stay the same in the long run? And keep in mind here, guys, they're asking specifically, will short-run aggregate supply change? So not aggregate demand, but SRAS. That's important. Okay, let's work this out. Oh, once again, these notes are in Unit 3. I would specifically look at the notes about the spending multiplier and the ones about fiscal policy. Those are going to be some handy notes for this one. Okay, now, very first thing we need to do here is we need to figure out how much, I think we were on B, right? Yeah. Newland's government is considering taking action to close the output gap. So we need to calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of change in government spending required to shift the aggregate demand curve to close the output gap. We need to show our work. So the output gap in this case is 100 billion. And the way I know that is because we should be outputting 500, right? That's normal. But currently right now we're only doing 400, okay? So that means the difference here is 100 billion. I'm going to put B for billion. Okay. So if we want to figure out how can we increase our GDP by 100 billion, right? Because we need to increase this 400 by 100 billion to get to our desired output, 500 billion. Well, if we know some basic things like the MPC and the MPS, we can figure out through the multiplier how much government spending would be needed to add $100 billion into our GDP. So first thing we got to do is let's figure out what our multiplier is here. And you may remember that the multiplier formula is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. Okay, in this case, it's 1 divided by 1 minus 0.8, or 1 divided by 0.2, okay? So 1 divided by 0.2, pretty simple math, is 5, okay? In other words, 0.2 goes into 1 5 times. So this is our multiplier. And this is going to be really key to answering this first question, okay? So what we want to do is figure out what do we need to multiply times 5 to equal 100 billion. No, not too hard, right? What you could do is just take 100 and divide that by 5. That'll give you the answer, 20, right? So in other words, we would need 20 billion of government spending. And as that flows through the economy, by the end of the whole process, by the end of that whole multiplier process, which you can check out in the spending multiplier notes, we would have added $100 billion to our GDP, and 100 billion plus 400 billion would get us to that magical 500 billion of GDP that we're going for. Okay, so that's how much government spending would go up. Oh, and where it says in what direction, the direction is we're going to increase. Okay. So we need to increase government spending by $20 billion, and that would give us the desired effect of raising GDP by 100 billion. All right, let's get that last part. I'll just go ahead and clear everything out here. We're still going for that magical number of 100 billion, but now let's think about how we could do this through a tax cut, okay? And hopefully you remember the tax multiplier. Alrighty, the tax multiplier is MPC divided by MPS. Okay, and you might be saying, well, Mr. White, I know the MPC is 0.8, but what's that MPS? Oh my gosh, how do we know that? Well, the MPS is just 1 minus MPC. We already figured that out, right? That's what MPS is, 1 minus MPC. So in this case, 1 minus 0.8 equals 0.2. So no more question marks. We know that the answer here is we need 0.2. 0.8 divided by 0.2 is 4. Okay, so this is our tax multiplier. Our tax multiplier. Okay, so in other words, whatever the tax cut is, the amount they cut taxes, we multiply it by 4, and that's how much GDP is going to change. But in this case, when we lower taxes, GDP rises by a factor of 4. when we raise taxes, GDP falls by a factor of 4. So in this case, we're trying to figure out what would we need to multiply by 4 to equal 100 billion. Well, once again, we can just do that same little division trick we did a minute ago. 100 divided by 4, and that gives us 25. All right. So that means that we could cut taxes. So that's the whole direction thing, right? We want taxes to go down by 25 billion. Okay, and that would tell us the answer for, I believe that is part 2 of question B. All right, now we've got some data to work with, and this will help us make a more objective decision. You know, this kind of thing can get kind of political because, of course, we know Republicans tend to favor tax cuts. Democrats, by and large, tend to favor more government spending programs. And we're not taking sides here. We're just going to look at this objectively. Remember that the spending multiplier is always bigger than the tax multiplier. Spending is always greater than tax cuts, okay? And that's just because, remember, the spending multiplier is 1 divided by MPS, okay? Whereas this is MPC divided by MPS, okay? So what we've seen here is that we can increase spending by only 20 billion, and it'll equal the 100 billion we want. Or we can cut taxes by 25 billion, and that would give us the 100 billion that we want. The thing is, guys, remember that cutting taxes is the same thing as spending money. So this $25 billion is more expensive than the $20 billion option. In other words, it's more costly for Congress and for the country to cut taxes by 25 billion than it is to increase spending by 20 billion. Yet we get the same $100 billion outcome. And really the outcome is the main thing we care about. Both of these lead to the same outcome. But since this option here is less expensive, we would say that spending is going to be better than the tax cut because we can basically get more bang for our buck, right? So you just need to explain that in your own words, but the fiscal policy action of spending more is going to be more effective in closing the output gap just because it's going to be more cost effective. It'll be less expensive for the country. Now, the last part, assume instead Newland's government decides not to take any policy action. Will short-run aggregate supply increase, decrease, or stay the same in the long run? And they want us to explain. Well, what's going to happen is that in the long run, short-run aggregate supply will increase. And the reason why short-run aggregate supply would increase is because if we're in a recession and Congress does nothing, what's going to happen is that people are going to start getting really desperate, right? The unemployment rate is going to be very, very high. And when the unemployment rate is very, very high, people aren't terribly picky about how much they get paid. A lot of the times people are willing to work for very low wages. So overall, when the country is in a recession, the amount of money that workers ask for goes down. When wages go down, that represents a decrease of input costs. And if we have a decrease of input costs, we know what that does. That's going to increase our SRAS. And so if we were to just kind of clear things out here, and let's kind of just think about this, we can put it on a graph and take a look at how it would look on our graph. Let me just erase whatever. I don't have to erase everything. This doesn't have to be perfect. Okay. So actually, you know what? Let me undo this AS line. Okay. So in other words, like if we started off somewhere over here like this, AS, AD, LRAS, here's our price level, and our output, I'm just going to put Y, okay? When we're over here, the economy is underproducing, and price level is lower than expected. Well, when the price level is lower than expected, you know, the expected price level is up here somewhere. I'll call this PL star. Like that's just basically where we should be. We're down here. Everything's cheaper than normal. So businesses will find this as a great opportunity to hire people because they can hire more workers and it doesn't cost them that much. They can produce more stuff. And so lower wages is a lower input cost. And over time, aggregate supply will shift over to the right because we know that markets always move back to equilibrium. So in the long run, we're going to end up going back to equilibrium, back to full output, but we're going to do it at a lower price level, which is actually kind of nice for everybody, right? So if Congress does nothing at all, We'll eventually get back to full output, full employment. We don't know how long that's going to take, but it's going to happen because of the fact that employers will start hiring more people, output will rise, and the unemployment rate will fall eventually in the long run until we get back to the natural rate of unemployment. All right, guys. Well, that is it. This has been a long review. I know it's maybe 5 minutes longer than the last one. Sorry. But if you have any questions, of course, please email me or contact me through Google Classroom. And good luck on your AP exams.